Well, good afternoon to everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good to be together on God's weekly festival. What a beautiful day here in the Sunshine State. I'm very glad that I moved here from Long Island 40 plus years ago. I never turned back. It's good to see all of you. I certainly want to welcome our visitors. We're very happy to have you here to worship the true God in Ocala, Florida. The title of this very brief sermonette, Unity, Part 1. Unity, Part 1. Let's begin by turning over to Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, and I need to move along. I have very limited time, so stay with me. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. This verse is not referring to physical skills or talents. It's referring to one's feelings, one's needs, one's circumstances, and fulfilling those needs as we are best able. Now, it's impossible for us to fulfill all people's needs at all times. That's just not possible. However, we can make progress in fulfilling needs if we are observant, perceptive, and most of all, if we're willing. In this message, I want to briefly discuss with you two individuals that personified Philippians 2, verse 3 in their life. In my view, these two individuals had the closest bond, the greatest unity of all individuals in the recorded Bible, with the exception of Jesus Christ and God the Father. That's how important unity is. And why did they have this unity, this closeness, this bond? Because they considered one another better than themselves. That's the value of that scripture in our life, in our marriages, in our relationships with one another at church and with our fellow man. Considering one another from the heart better than oneself. Come with me over to 1 Samuel 17, and we'll read the last two verses in that chapter, verse 57 and 58. 1 Samuel 17, verse 57 and 58. One Samuel 17, verse 57. And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. We're all familiar with this event. This was when David slew Goliath, the Philistine giant. And Abner, the captain of the guard, is now presenting David before King Saul. And can we picture the scene? David has Goliath's head in his hand. Talk about a sight. All right, verse 58. And Saul said to him, Whose son art thou, young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Now let's read 1 Samuel 18, the first 11 verses, and then we'll comment. And we'll also comment as we go along. 1 Samuel 18, verse 1. And it came to pass, when David had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. So Jonathan immediately became bonded with David, we read. Verse 2. And Saul took David that day and would let him go no more home to his father's house. So now David was a servant in King Saul's residence. Verse 3. Then Jonathan and David, notice both of them, they both made a covenant because Jonathan loved David as his own soul. Verse 4. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David and his garments, even to his sword and to his bow and to his girdle. Now, brethren, what we need to understand here, this was symbolic. Jonathan giving his robe, his bow and sword was symbolic because, in effect, Jonathan was forfeiting his inheritance to be the next king and telling David, you're going to be the next king. That's why he gave him the role. And David understood that. Now, Jonathan may have known or may have perceived that it was God's will to have David be the next king. But nonetheless, that was a very altruistic gesture. Verse 5. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So David was well received by everyone. And it came to pass, as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. Verse 7. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. Verse 10. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand. He played the harp, as at other times. And there was a javelin in Saul's hand. Verse 11. And Saul cast a javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. Wow. I'm sure the first time David wasn't expecting it at all. And he had to move pretty quickly. Well, David was a dancer, and dancers move pretty quickly. But from that point on, David had to flee for his life. And Jonathan tried to protect David. He tried to defend David with Saul, his father. He was explaining to Saul that David was faithful and he was a blessing to the Israelite nation. David was also a blessing to Saul. He served Saul faithfully. He was dedicated to Saul. He never tried to usurp Saul's authority. But it was all to no avail. As a matter of fact, we don't have time to read the account. You can read the account in 1 Samuel 17 all the way to 30. But there was one occasion that Saul actually tried to kill his own son Jonathan the same way he tried to kill David, throwing a spear at him. Jonathan was so furious. He was so angry because all he did was protect and defend David and look out for his own father's best interest. But Saul was bound and determined, we all know this, to slay David. Eventually, Jonathan had to meet David secretly in the field that David was hiding. David was hiding in the local environs at that time, the fields, the little villages, the towns, the caves, but it was in the local area, and he was in constant touch with Jonathan. But it finally reached the point where Jonathan had to meet him in this field. It was secluded, far away from civilization, to tell David that he had to flee as far as he could go because Saul was determined and had the whole army to track him down and slay him. So they met at this field, and it was very emotional, very dramatic. Let's read the account in 1 Samuel 20, verse 41 and 42. That's also the last two verses in this chapter, where Jonathan and David are now meeting in the field that David was hiding in, and they're going to part one from another. And it was a very sorrowful time, as well as emotional for both of them, because they had become so close. (1 Samuel 20, verse 41 and 42. 1 Samuel 20, verse 41. And as soon as the lad was gone, David arose out of the place he was hiding toward the south. And what did David do? And fell on his face to the ground and bowed himself 3 times. And they kissed one another and wept one with another until David exceeded. You see, not only did Jonathan consider David better than himself, but it was a two-way street. We read here where David bowed his face to the ground in the prone position 3 times in front of Jonathan. In effect, he was paying obeisance to Jonathan. He was deferring to Jonathan. So David considered Jonathan better than himself. That's why they were so close. That's what makes for unity when it's a combined involvement. You see? And what do? They wept. I mean, these are 2 grown, they were young men, but they were warriors. And they wept, and they clinged to one another. They cried, they bawled. And it says it didn't stop until David, he was exhausted. It wasn't 5-10 minutes. I mean, these 2 men really cared for each other. They were tight. They were close, crying, one bawling. They're going to leave each other. They did not know this. If they knew this, it would have even been more involved crying. But they would never see each other again in this physical life. They didn't know that at the time, but they were still so passionate, so close, so bonded. You know something? That's how you and me should be with God. Or at least we should be striving to be that way with Him. Close. Well, not way out here. Not way out here. We try to get closer. Let's read verse 42. We'll move along. 1 Samuel 20, verse 42. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for as much as we have sworn, both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever." And David arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. Now, the next time that David heard about Jonathan, when it was reported to him that Jonathan was slain in battle. We don't have time to go there. You can read it in 2 Samuel 20. I'll paraphrase what David said when he heard that, when he received that news. How he was affected. He said, Jonathan was delightful to me. And he said, Jonathan's love for me surpassed the love of woman. Now, he did not mean that in an inappropriate way. He meant the loyalty, the passion, the unconditional love, the unreserved commitment and unity. That's what he meant. That's what he meant. Let's finish up with the 2 individuals who have the closest unity in the entire universe by far. Of course, you know who I'm referring to, Jesus Christ and God the Father. They have the closest unity of all. John 10, verse 30. John 10, verse 30. This is what Jesus says. John 10, verse 30. Here's what Jesus Christ says. I and my Father are one. One in every aspect of life. Why are they one? Why do they have that unity? Because obviously they love one another, but they also defer to one another. And you know what else? They have respect for authority. Without respect for authority, there can be no unity. That's how we want to be, don't we? Now let me conclude by commenting about what Mr. Vella said just a few weeks ago about the Ocala congregation, and I concur with what he said. He's the minister. He said, the Ocala congregation has a good reputation within and without for friendliness, and unity. And I concur with that. There are flaws, but we do have a good reputation, and that's commendable for friendliness, unity. But I want to encourage us all to increase upon that. Let's work on having a great reputation in the Ocala congregation, within and without. Next time we'll cover unity, part 2. But for now, have a very unified remainder of the Sabbath.